Dear social sciences teachers, as you now know, climate change is one of the most significant issues of our times, and its impacts are becoming inseparable from our day-to-day lives. It is critical that our students are made aware of this issue and that they understand this problem from different disciplinary perspectives. In this lecture, we show the societal impacts of climate change and show you how you can teach some topics in social sciences using climate-related examples. We present educational resources that bring climate studies into the mainstream undergraduate social sciences curriculum. This will allow you to teach topics in the social sciences using climate-related examples without deviating from your prescribed syllabus. This will lead to an increased climate awareness amongst your students. Again, I'd like to reiterate, you as a social sciences teacher can continue to teach topics in the social sciences syllabus, but the use of climate-related examples through the educational resources we will show you will lead to increased understanding of climate change amongst your students. Using these digital pedagogical resources in your classroom, you can learn how to incorporate a multidisciplinary approach in your teaching. How do you introduce relevant topics, in this case it is climate change, in your discipline? How do you use technology in your classroom, and how do you enhance your students' learning? You can integrate climate science in your teaching and use these educational resources to teach topics in the social sciences. These topics include climate refugees, environmental migration, climate justice, social vulnerability, urban climate resilience, climate change and behavior, climate change and children, food security, human health, climate change and cities, poverty, tribes, peace and conflict, global security, and many other such topics. Let us take a look at some of these lesson plans that integrate topics in social sciences with climate-related topics. Again, you can teach topics in the social sciences using these lesson plans, but the use of climate-related examples which are going to be shown here will lead to a greater understanding of climate change amongst your students. The lesson plans that we look at in this particular lecture include capitalism and climate change, poverty and climate, stress and coping, which would be useful for psychology teachers, climate refugees and environmental migration, and things such as climate consciousness in constitutions of different countries. Let's take a look at our first lesson plan titled Capitalism and Climate Change. If as a teacher of social sciences you are teaching about capitalism and topics such as capitalist modes of production, rise of capitalism, consumerism, material economy, commodification, production of capital, we invite you to take a look at this particular lesson plan. The approximate time required for this is between 80 to 90 minutes. This lesson plan includes a reading that first describes the history of capitalism and capitalist modes of production. It also includes about a 20-minute long video micro lecture that describes production and consumption patterns of a capitalist society. This has led to an exploitation of Earth's finite natural resources. Another reading that describes the link between capitalist or consumer economies and climate change also makes up part of this lesson plan. Let us take a look at these contents in some amount of detail. Here is a step-by-step guide towards using the resources of this lesson plan in your social sciences classroom or laboratory. We have suggested these steps as a possible plan of action, and as a teacher, you may customize this lesson plan according to your preferences and requirements. Start by introducing the topic. You can use the reading titled Historical Capitalism with Capitalist Civilization, which has been developed by Emanuel Wallerstein, for you to introduce the topic of capitalism, ideology of capitalism, and describe its historical development in societies. You can explain to your students how capitalism has always existed as a historical social process. Through this reading, you can describe how commodification of processes has led to the rise in capitalism. This reading also includes ways for you to describe different modes of capitalist production, factors involved such as availability of labor, the role of the proletariat in the building of capital. You can then describe how a feudal yet egalitarian European society in the 15th century was transformed by the 17th century with the establishment of a capitalist society. You can discuss with your students using the reading provided how the emergence of capitalism in the first industrialized nation, Great Britain, alongside the agrarian and industrial revolutions, was responsible partially towards global warming that we know of. You can now extend the understanding of your students through a short video from The Story of Stuff by Annie Leonard to describe how capitalism can lead to a consumerist society. You can use this video to describe consumerism, show how it is linked to social and cultural identities of nations. You can explain to your students how linear production and consumption patterns, specifically in the US, has led potentially to several environmental and social issues. You can emphasize the link to climate change now by saying, how does production and consumption of goods release large amounts of greenhouse gases and contribute significantly to climate change? In this next step, you can make this link between climate change and topic in discipline, that is capitalism, far more obvious to your students. You can use this reading, which is titled Climate Change and Capitalism. It's been developed by Jonathan Park at the University of Utah, which discusses the link between capitalism and climate change. Explain to your student how the consumer ideology in a capitalist society results in overproduction and overconsumption of goods. You can discuss the implications of this, such as the exploitation of natural resources, high energy expenditure, excess waste production, and extensive environmental degradation due to pollution. Emphasize to your students that capitalist modes of production often require large-scale burning of fossil fuels in order to meet energy requirements, and this in turn contributes to global warming. You can use the tools and concepts learned in this lesson plan through the resources mentioned before to discuss and determine answers to the following questions for your students. What is capitalism? Describe the global rise of a capitalist society. What are capitalist modes of production? What is a materials economy and how does it impact consumption patterns? How has capitalism affected climate change? Learning outcomes. The tools in this lesson plan will enable your students to 1. Explain the concepts of capitalism and capitalist modes of production, describe the rise of capitalism and a materials economy, discuss the various factors and aspects of a capitalist society, explain how social and cultural identities are increasingly linked to consumerism, but most importantly, how your students will be able to describe the link between capitalism and climate change. If you or your students would like to explore this topic further, some additional resources are provided in this lesson plan too. A lesson plan titled Poverty and Climate, an Inextricable Link. As an undergraduate economics or social sciences teacher, you can use this set of computer-based tools to help you in teaching about poverty, the impact of climate change on global poverty, and ways to manage it in the current and future scenarios. This lesson plan includes reading resources that help your students learn about poverty, how it is exacerbated by climate change, and what might be some measures needed by the UNDP program for sustainable development goals to be met. Thus, the use of this lesson plan will allow you to integrate the teaching of a climate science topic with a core topic in social sciences, in this case poverty, global poverty for you. The topics in discipline include poverty, absolute or extreme poverty, what is the poverty trap, what is the poverty cycle, human development indices, sustainable development goals, and a variety of climate adaptation, mitigation, resilience related topics. This takes about 60 to 80 minutes. The contents of this lesson plan include two readings. One, a chapter reading that defines what is poverty. It defines the poverty in the context of a country's economy and the causes of poverty. It focuses on several Southeast Asian countries, and it also describes what is the relationship of climate change and poverty and outlines strategies to counteract the impacts of climate change. Another short story, which is a feature story based on a report by the World Bank that describes the threat of climate change to poor people and how might you offset it through mitigation and adaptation strategies. Here is a step-by-step guide for you to use this lesson plan in your social sciences classroom or lab. Again, we have just suggested these as a possible plan of action, and you may customize this lesson plan to suit your needs and requirements. Start by introducing the topic using a chapter reading titled Impact of Climate Change on Poverty. This is from a teacher's guidebook on climate change, which is titled Integrating Climate Change Issues in Southeast Asian Schools, which has been developed by the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, or SEMIO for short. You can use this reading to first define to your students what is poverty, explain the definition of the term, and emphasize that this may not be the same for all nations and is based on the country's level of economic progress. With this reading, you can explain to your students what might be causes of poverty and parameters such as access to food, water, shelter, healthcare, infrastructure, education that essentially define the state of well-being of poverty in a nation's population. Using this text, you can have your students understand what is absolute or extreme poverty, poverty trap, and you can also use this to discuss with your student how poverty might disproportionately affect women, children, elderly or infirm, making them far more vulnerable to the impacts of poverty. So, here issues such as gender and climate change would also be something you could introduce in your classroom. Using this reading, you can also start to initiate a discussion of what is the relationship between poverty and climate change, how they are interconnected, what are the impacts of climate change on poverty. Emphasize to your student how climate change exacerbates poverty and therefore the vulnerability of the poor. You can now explore this topic a little further using another feature story. This is titled Rapid Climate Informed Development Needed to Keep Climate Change for Pushing More than 100 million people into poverty by 2030. This is a huge number. This has been developed, the report by the World Bank, and is based on a report which is published by them titled Shockwaves, Managing the Impacts of Climate Change on Poverty. There is a link to the full report in this lesson plan, but we are just showing you the feature story, which includes a short video that is created by the World Bank that highlights the need for policies to manage the effects of climate change to protect the poor, the ones that are most affected by climate change. You can read the associated text and emphasize to your students that measures that are taken to eradicate global poverty can be thwarted by climate-related factors, and therefore there is a need to address climate change in conjunction with poverty alleviating development work. Questions and assignments that you can ask your students. Define poverty. What is the vicious scale of poverty? It is the poor who are affected most by climate change. Do you agree? Give reasons to support your answer. Explain the impacts of climate change on poor women and children. How are the struggles against poverty and climate change interlinked, and what are policies and actions that might be needed to mitigate climate change as well as reduce poverty? The learning outcomes. The tools in this lesson plan will enable your social sciences students to 1. identify poverty and climate change as two very important challenges of sustainable goal development. 2. Discuss the causes of poverty, understand terms such as poverty trap or poverty cycle, learn the relationship between poverty and climate change, distinguish the ways in which men, women, and children might be differently affected by poverty and climate change, and appreciate the need for new climate change adaptation and mitigation policies. If you or your students would like to explore this topic in further detail, some additional resources are provided in this lesson plan. A lesson plan titled Stress and Coping with Climate Change that might be very useful for psychology teachers. As an undergraduate psychology teacher, you can use this lesson plan to teach about stress and coping. This lesson plan will help your students to learn about stress, its nature, its causes, consequences for individuals. Students will also view and discuss a resource that reports on the impact of climate change, which is a causative factor of stress on the lives of people globally. So, if you are a psychology or other social sciences teacher and topics such as stress, coping, the GAS model, cognitive appraisal of stress, stressors and stress management, you might want to take a look at this lesson plan in some detail. This lesson plan includes a reading that first introduces what are the causes and consequences of stress. This describes the physiological responses to stressors, the cognitive appraisal of a situation, various factors that can cause stress, the effect of stress on health, and various coping strategies. A video that shows the role of climate change as a stressor on the lives of people around the globe, and a classroom activity which is a role-playing activity to improve students' understanding of climate change as a stressor. Here is a step-by-step guide that you could use in your social sciences, psychology, classroom or laboratory. Please feel free to customize this lesson plan to best suit your needs. Step 1. Introduce this topic through a reading. Introduce what is stress and coping by using a reading from the chapter titled Health, Stress and Coping by Jennifer Wallinger from the Introduction to Psychology by British Columbia Open Textbooks. Using this reading, you can explain to your students what are stressors, what are physiological responses to stressors. You can emphasize the General Adaptation Syndrome or GAS model. You can elaborate on the physical, psychological, personality-related, social and cultural factors that can cause stress. You can discuss the impacts of stress on health and task-related performances, and so on and so forth. Next, you can conduct a hands-on lab activity. You can first play a video titled The Human Face of Climate Change, which has been developed by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies to explore the effects of climate-related factors and perceived climate change as a stressor in people's lives. This video features several individuals from different parts of the world, from various walks of life, who talk about the impact of climate change on their personal lives. At some point, you can pause this video to inquire whether your students could recognize stress in the individuals featured. You can have them recall the testimonies of different persons featured in the video to discuss their stress scenarios. Finally, you can discuss the characteristics of stress and coping strategies that are employed in various scenarios shown in this particular video. Now, this is an interactive group activity that can be conducted in your classroom. This is to help understand stress and coping through a role-playing activity. Your students can engage in this role-play activity called A Day in the Life of. And in this activity, your teams can imagine and play out a day in the life of the person from the video mentioned earlier to understand the nature and consequences of stress experienced by these individuals. For example, in the video, there was a 11-year-old schoolgirl from the Bahamas called Jessica, who was affected by severe floods. A team can be given about 10 minutes to choose a character, build a story around a day in the life of this individual to better understand the topic at a deep level, enable them to reflect and empathize with the experience of an individual who might be impacted by climate change. You can use this lesson plan to ask your students questions such as, what is stress and coping? What are the factors that can cause stress? What are some of the most important stressors? How does it affect human health? How is your performance affected by stress? What might be different strategies to cope with it? And what are the possible links between climate-related factors and stress? The learning outcomes. Using the tools in this lesson plan, your students will learn to understand the nature and characteristics of stress, identify physical, psychological, personality-related, social and cultural factors that can cause stress, explain the physical and work-related consequences of stress, elaborate on various coping strategies used by individuals, and discuss stress caused by climate change. If you or your students would like to explore this topic further, some of the additional resources listed here might be useful for you. This includes a reading from the American Psychological Association called Psychology and Climate Change, and also a short fiction anthology of stories which is related. A lesson plan titled Climate Consciousness in the National Constitution. As a social sciences teacher, you can use this lesson plan to teach about the constitution of a country, what might be components of a nation's constitution, and can we recognize that climate change is indeed a fundamental constitution issue for certain nations. We will use the example of the constitution of the nation of Bhutan as an example in this lesson plan. Now, just for your knowledge, Bhutan transitioned from a monarchy-led state to a democratic nation recently and adopted its constitution in 2008. When you look at the constitution of Bhutan, you can have your students understand what might be the various parts of a nation's constitution, including the preamble, fundamental rights and duties of a citizen, principles of state policy, and so on and so forth. This lesson plan will include a tool to study the constitutions of different nations, compare their national policies on various issues, the one which is most important in this case being climate change, and the environment. In the Constitution of Bhutan, the promotion of gross national happiness is a principle of state policy, and this lesson plan will enable your students to understand how Bhutan's gross national happiness is being threatened by climate change. So, if you are teaching topics such as democracy, constitutions, articles of the constitution, preamble, parliament, government, citizenships, fundamental duties, rights, principles of state policies, rules of governance, poverty, environmental policy, and so on and so forth, we invite you to take a closer look at this lesson plan. This lesson plan starts with a short video micro lecture that describes briefly what a nation's constitution is, why is it fundamentally important. A short reading, which is the Constitution of the Kingdom of Bhutan as an example of the constitution of a democratic nation, with an emphasis on state policy that promotes gross national happiness. A video and an associated reading, which is by the UNDP, that lists the impacts of climate change on Bhutan's state policy of pursuing gross national happiness. There is a classroom or a lab interactive activity on a website that allows you to study and compare the constitution of almost 200 countries that you could also use in your classroom. Here is a step-by-step guide that you could use in your social sciences classroom. Again, please feel free to customize this lesson plan according to your requirements. You can first introduce the topic using this video micro lecture titled, What is a Constitution? Developed by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Using this video micro lecture, you can introduce what is the Constitution, why is it fundamentally important for every nation to have it. You can explain to your student how the Constitution defines the aims, ideals of the nation that it represents. Different parts of the Constitution, such as the preamble, articles of the Constitution, state policies, pillars of democracy, the parliament, government, judiciary, citizenship, fundamental rights and duties can all be stressed using this particular tool. Now, you can develop this topic further in your classroom using an example. You use the Constitution of the Kingdom of Bhutan, which is present on a website shown here by the National Council of Bhutan, as an example to define or describe the different parts of a particular country's constitution. You can have your students go over the overview of the Constitution and the different sections within it. You can draw the attention of your students to one part in this Constitution that pertains to in the environment and discuss what is the fundamental duty of every citizen to protect the natural environment. This is taking the example of Bhutan, but you can always have your students try to relate it to what is happening in their nation. You can use this point, which is how in the Constitution it is listed that it is the duty of citizens to prevent its ecological degradation and thereby ensure a safe and healthy environment. Using this point, have your students think about the preamble that pledges to enhance the unity, happiness and well-being of the people of all time. Now, you can discuss this topic further. There is a news report titled "Climate Change Threatens Bhutan's Gross National Happiness" that is listed in this particular tool. You can play a documentary listed here, which is titled "Bhutan in Pursuit of Sustainable Development," to sort of introduce to your students how climate change is adversely affecting a cross section of people in the nation of Bhutan. You can discuss how this goes against the ethos of the Constitution in achieving their gross national happiness in the country. You can use this text to then discuss what is the impact of climate change on the livelihoods of a quarter of Bhutan's population that live in poverty and depend on subsistence farming and local natural resources, who might be very vulnerable to changing weather patterns and melting glaciers. You can use this report to explain the threats to Bhutan's natural resources, what are the measures adopted to adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change, and explain to your students, and this is very interesting, how Bhutan has strived to become a carbon neutral state by increasing its forest cover to 70 to 80% of land, and now is a very big carbon sink for the entire world. There is a website called Constitute that we invite you to take a look at to teach to your students. This has been produced by the Comparative Constitutions Project of the University of Texas, and it studies almost 200 different national constitutions. Using this tool, you can discuss the constitution of a nation, compare policies between constitutions. In this case, we would invite you to look at the environment aspects as well as climate aspects in here. You can have your students answer questions such as, how is the Constitution structured? What are the purposes of a government and how is it organized? Who is a citizen of a nation? What are the fundamental rights and duties of a citizen? What might be some similarities between Bhutan's constitution and your nation's constitution? And how is Bhutan's gross national happiness being impacted by climate change? The learning outcomes with the usage of this lesson plan. This will enable your students to be able to define and describe the importance of a constitution, learn about the constitution of your country as well as that of the country of Bhutan, and to compare your country's constitution with that of different countries. It will allow you to understand what might be policies of different countries on topics such as climate, climate change, and the environment. The fundamental duties of a citizen towards the protection of an environment and how climate change might be affecting the national happiness index in a particular nation. If you or your students would like to explore this topic in greater detail, some additional resources are listed here. A lesson plan titled Climate Refugees and Environmental Migration. As a social sciences teacher, you can use this lesson plan to teach topics such as social environmental policy, climate change and human migration, what are climate refugees or environmental migrants, and climate justice. This lesson plan should take about 120 minutes. It contains a reading that discusses climate change related human migration and introduces the term climate refugees by describing how climate change is accelerating migration from various parts of a particular nation. In this case, we will use the example of Bangladesh. There is a classroom or a lab activity, an extremely interactive and interesting activity, which is titled a story map, to learn about various countries and locations there that are now becoming uninhabitable because of climate change, and entire communities that are being forced to leave their homes and migrate to new locations. We provide in this lesson plan a step-by-step guide that you can use in your classroom to better explain the topics in your discipline. You may feel free to modify these, the lesson plan to suit your convenience or requirements. First, introduce the topic of refugees and human migration using the reading that is provided. The terms environmental migration and climate refugees can be introduced to your students. You can discuss the reasons for climate change related human displacement and the impending climate refugee crisis in various parts of the world, especially in a country such as Bangladesh, using an article from The Guardian titled Dhaka, the city where climate refugees are already a reality. In this article, you can provide your students an actual example of this crisis of climate refugees by describing how climate change in Bangladesh is causing large-scale migration of their residents from different parts of the country into the capital Dhaka. And then they can learn about and discuss how these cities such as Dhaka might struggle to support the large number of incoming refugees. You can explore this topic with your students in great detail through a map making and visualization technique by using a story map tool titled Climate Migrants. In this activity, your students will learn about several regions and communities across the world that are affected by climate change. They will understand various climate change related problems such as inundation, erosion, drought, conflict, strain on resources that are caused by this resulting human migration. There are a wide number of locations in this lesson plan and this tool of it, which includes portions in Alaska, an island called Kiribati, Papua New Guinea, Syria, and so on and so forth. Instructions of how to use this particular tool are provided in this lesson plan and in the links that are shown here. Questions and assignments that you can ask your students through this lesson plan. What are the reasons for human migration? What are climate change related problems that threaten the existence of some regions of the world? What are the challenges faced by climate refugees or environmental migrants? What might be some measures or policies that different governments can adopt in order to tackle this extreme challenge of climate related human migration? The learning outcomes. Through this lesson plan, your students will learn to 1. Identify climate change related threats to the existence of some regions in the world. 2. Describe the problems of environmental migration and the term climate refugee. 3. Discuss the challenges faced by climate refugees. 4. What might be the problems caused by large-scale human migration? And 5. How can you propose policies to handle this challenge which is posed by climate change related migration? If you or your students would like to explore this topic in more detail, some of these additional resources may be useful. See these and more lesson plans that integrate topics in the social sciences with climate sciences at tropicsu.org and at the link shown here. Now, as a teacher of social sciences, if you do not want to use an entire lesson plan, but just individual teaching tools that integrate topics in the social sciences with climate awareness, you might want to take a look at some of our teaching tools presented here. These could include a classroom or a lab activity to learn about what are the suitable climatic conditions for a particular crop and how climate change may affect food production, or a reading that talks about climate change related human migration, an entire teaching module dealing with climate change, the environment and human health, a video on food security and learn about the relationship between food production and climate, an audio podcast titled Has Humanity Pushed Earth into a New Geological Epoch titled The Anthropocene, and many other such tools. Let us take a look at a few of these in some detail. This is a classroom laboratory activity titled Climate Change and Food Security, in which your students can learn about what are the suitable climatic conditions for a crop and how climate change may affect food production. In this case, we will be looking at one specific species, which is the cocoa plant. In this activity, your students will create maps using an online geographic information systems tool titled the ArcGIS online tool. Using this map making technique, they will learn about the relationship between climate change and food production through a case study of cocoa production in West Africa. Your students can answer questions such as what are the effects of climate change on cocoa production in Africa, what is the impact of cocoa production on West African landscape. This particular tool has been developed by Roseanne Lowe, Rebecca Rogers and Amy Potter and is available at the Science Education Resource Center SERC at Carleton College. An e-learning course titled Impact of Climate Change on Children. In this course, it is a short MOOC. Students can understand what is the effects of climate change on children. They will be able to discuss climate resilience and climate change mitigation actions that can benefit children and learn about empowerment of children, protection of children's rights, all in the context of climate change. You can find answers to questions such as how can climate change affect children? What might be climate change mitigation actions that can actually help children? This particular MOOC is a short MOOC and has been developed by the UNCC Learn platform and is available at the links shown here. An entire teaching module titled Climate Change, the Environment and Human Health to learn about the impacts of climate change on human health and to discuss climate adaptation and mitigation measures that would reduce these health-related risks. Your students will be able to apply systems thinking to learn about changing climatic conditions on planet Earth, what might be the effects of climate change on organisms and ecosystems, and consequently, what might be impacts on the distribution and spread of climate-sensitive diseases. They will discuss mitigation measures, adaptation actions that could benefit human health. The topics in this module include temperature-related death and illness, air quality impacts, extreme events, vector-borne diseases, water-related illnesses, food safety, nutrition and distribution, and mental health and well-being. This particular tool has been developed by Dana Brown and Stephanie Dawn. It is hosted at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences at the link shown. So, dear social sciences teachers, we hope you find these lesson plans and teaching tools useful and we hope you will use it in your classroom to not only improve the understanding of discipline-specific topics, but to also increase the awareness of climate change amongst your students.